Salahuddin Part 4 Pitfalls in Syria. Aleppo, Syria, 1175. As the morning sun rose, Salahuddin looked at the walled city of Aleppo from a nearby hill. The attack by the assassins on his life the night before had left him perplexed. He had underestimated the shrewdness of Gumushtigin. Salahuddin could not imagine that Gumushtigin would hire assassins to kill him. The assassins were a secret group fortifying themselves in the dense mountains of Syria, and they were famous for targeted killings of political personnel of high power in both the Muslim and Crusader ranks. Ideologically, they followed the Shia sect, and thus they did not like Salahuddin for abolishing the Fatimid Caliphate. So it was very easy for Gumushtigin to convince the assassins' leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, to attack Salahuddin. On top of that, more news had recently come to Salahuddin that the Crusaders, under the command of Raymond of Tripoli, were gathering forces and raiding the borders of Salahuddin's Syrian territory. It was rumored that Gumushtigin had a hand in that as well. All the pieces of the puzzle were now falling into place. Salahuddin could see how treacherous Gumushtigin had been. He looked at the citadel of Aleppo. He realized how far away he was from gaining total control of Syria. The capture of Aleppo seemed like a dream now far away. Salahuddin had to respond immediately against the threat of the Crusaders. He couldn't risk his life and the loss of his army to continue the siege on a heavily fortified city like Aleppo. In this round, Gumushtigin had won. Salahuddin lifted the siege and took his army back to Damascus. From there, he sent forces to deter the raiding Crusaders. Salahuddin's recent momentum in Syria caused a lot of jealousy in the Zengid leadership. The emerging leader of the Zengids, Saif al-Din, was a cousin of Nur ad-Din. So he got the support of Prince as-Saleh and Gumushtigin. Saif al-Din soon united the quarreling Zengid emirs and solidified his position on a vast territory including Mosul and Aleppo. To weaken the position of Salahuddin in Syria, they launched a massive propaganda campaign stating that Salahuddin had forgotten his responsibility of freeing Jerusalem from the Crusaders. Salahuddin's reputation in Syria as a warrior of the Holy War was heavily damaged because of this. Salahuddin was under heavy pressure to take action, but his army was not yet strong enough to recapture Jerusalem, so he devised another plan. Salahuddin strengthened his forces in the cities of Horns and Hama in Syria, and from there he could launch skirmishes in the border territories of the Crusader states. These skirmishes were quite successful and in many cases drove Crusaders to withdraw. These victories worked as a checkmate for Salahuddin against the Zengid propaganda. Salahuddin's popularity soared among the Syrians as never before. In the following weeks, the political and territorial conflict between the Zengids and Ayyubids became so intensified that there was no way to avoid war. The armies met near Hama in March of 1175. Salahuddin was vastly outnumbered and had no intention of fighting his fellow Muslims. So Salahuddin proposed handing over Homs and Hama to the Zengids and in return asked acknowledgement as the ruler of Damascus on behalf of Princess Saleh. But the Zengids, led by Saif al-Din, were unmoved. Their reply was, surrender all lands in Syria and return to Egypt. The negotiation failed and the confrontation was unavoidable. Salahuddin's military skills and experiences had been greatly boosted by his recent military campaigns. This was reflected in how he arranged his forces to face the stronger opponent. He placed his army at the horns of Hama, hills by the gorge of the Orontes River. As soon as the Zengids attacked, they found themselves fighting the battle uphill and pinned by the river at one side. The Zengids' numerical advantage was nullified. Salahuddin launched a strong counterattack with his most veteran soldiers, immediately collapsing one wing of the Zengid army. another wing followed shortly thereafter. The Zengids were surrounded from 3 sides and were thrashed. Another victory for Salah-ad-Din. Through tactics and determination, Salah-ad-Din would now be able to force the Zengids into a truce. The Zengids conceded that Salah-ad-Din should keep his territories in Syria. But the prince would still be in Aleppo under Saif al-Din's guardianship. Finally, peace among the Muslims in Syria had begun. The victory against the Zengids was a crucial development in Salah-ad-Din's political career. After the victory, Salah-ad-Din was acknowledged by the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad as Sultan of Egypt and Syria. And as sovereign king, he no longer needed the patronage of the Zengid prince. Both in Cairo and in Damascus, coins were being minted with his official titles, and the Friday prayer sermon in the mosques, or khutbahs, started mentioning him as the sole ruler, omitting the name of a Saleh. This was a decisive move. Officially, Salah-ad-Din was no longer a part of the Zengid dynasty. But his good fortune didn't last long. During the summer of 1175, a bad drought made the continuation of fighting with the Crusaders an impossibility. The Crusaders were also hit by the same situation, so they made peace with Salah-ad-Din, and there was a pause on ongoing conflicts. Salah-ad-Din could take a break from military campaigns and focus on the administration of his vast empire that included Egypt, Yemen, Hijaz, consisting of Mecca and Medina, and Syria. Hardly a year had passed. Political turmoil returned in Syria. Saif al-Din started looking for trouble in order to fight Salah-ad-Din and to gain his territories. So Salah-ad-Din gathered his forces and marched northwards from Damascus towards Aleppo. On the way, in a place called Tel al-Sultan, he encountered the army of Saif al-Din. Salah-ad-Din's army was exhausted by their march, but the general lack of leadership and military skills amongst the Zengid leaders caused a delay in initiating the fight. This gave the Ayyubid army an unexpected opportunity to rest and regain their strength. When the fighting finally began the following day, battle-hardened Salah-ad-Din took full advantage of the incompetence of the Zengid leaders. As soon as the wings of both armies met one another, Salah-ad-Din charged forward at the center. The Zengid soldiers became panicked by this surprising maneuver and failed to keep their formation. The Zengids were decimated and Saif al-Din narrowly escaped. The whole Zengid war camp, including horses, armors, arms, and baggage trains, were captured by the Ayyubids. All the captured riches were distributed among the soldiers. Salah-ad-Din kept nothing for himself, a custom that Salah-ad-Din followed in every battle of his life. Saif al-Din fled to Aleppo. After the battle, Salah-ad-Din moved north, capturing more towns in northern Syria from the Zengid command. Eventually, he reached Aleppo region and laid siege to the castle of Azaz, a formidable and strategically important site. One night during the siege, Salah-ad-Din was having a discussion with his emirs inside his tent. A man dressed in black suddenly entered the tent and stabbed Salah-ad-Din in the head with a knife. Fortunately, Salah-ad-Din had been wearing a chainmail hood under his turban, and the first blow slipped and only cut his cheek. Salah-ad-Din grabbed the man's knife hand and started to twist. The assassin tried to strike again at Salah-ad-Din's neck. The strength and resistance of Salah-ad-Din were enough to stop the assassin from landing a lethal blow. Still, the attacker's knife was able to cut through the leather armor on Salah-ad-Din's shoulder and inflicted a wound. By this time, the emirs in the tent had fully realized what was going on and came forward to rescue their sultan. The assassin was struck down by them. While all of this was going on, a second and third assassin rushed into the tent and started attacking the emirs, but the chaos and screaming had alerted the guards. They came running and killed the assassins. Salah-ad-Din's wounds were not severe, but he was profoundly shaken. He realized how serious of a threat the assassins had become. He immediately took precautions and raised guards around the camp to prevent any intruders from entering unnoticed. After a month of siege, the castle of Azaz fell. Now, Aleppo was completely surrounded. Salah-ad-Din didn't want to launch a full-fledged attack and destroy the city. This would cause a lot of bloodshed on both sides, and Salah-ad-Din didn't think it would be wise to prolong the campaign against his fellow Muslims unnecessarily. So when the Zengids in Aleppo offered a truce and proposed more territorial control to Salah-ad-Din, he accepted their offer. The whole of northern Syria came under the Ayyubid dynasty except Aleppo. Now came time to settle scores with the assassins. Salah-ad-Din launched a campaign into the territories occupied by the assassins. Soon he reached the castle of Masyaf, which belonged to the assassins' leader himself, Rashid ad-Din Sinan. Salah-ad-Din laid siege to the castle. Day after day, Salah-ad-Din sent his army to occupy the castle. Every time, the assassins resisted fiercely. The siege became long and bloody, but Salah-ad-Din was relentless, wanting to see the end of it. So the fight continued. Finally, the assassins gave up and offered to make peace. Salah-ad-Din now had two choices. He could either accept the peace or could continue the siege. The castle of Masyaf was a tough defensive site, fortified with walls and towers placed on top of a mountain. Continuing the capture of the castle would mean that Salah-ad-Din would have to accept great losses and significantly weaken his army. This would give the Crusaders and the Zengids opportunities to make moves against him. After considering these factors, Salah-ad-Din took the wiser route. He accepted the truce. A treaty was signed. Rashid ad-Din Sinan promised not to attack Salah-ad-Din ever again and swore his allegiance. Although the assassins were not completely wiped out, Salah-ad-Din still could neutralize the threat of the assassins. Salah-ad-Din could turn an enemy into a strength, one less enemy to worry about. Finally, the situation in Syria was stable. The Zengids were no longer a threat. The assassins were under control, and the Crusaders had stopped their raids. Salah-ad-Din now had a brief period of peace. He could finally focus on preparing for his ultimate goal, Jerusalem. He returned to Cairo, focused on fortification of his territories on different fronts, reorganized his army, and started planning a full-on offensive against the Crusaders to win back Jerusalem. After years of political struggle and bloodshed with his fellow Muslims, Salah-ad-Din thought now he would be able to achieve his ultimate goal. Little did he know that he would soon have to flee the battlefield, narrowly escaping death. This was Salah-ad-Din's first major campaign against the Crusaders, and it resulted in the most devastating defeat of his life at the Battle of Montgisard.